Today marks the first of many revisits for AMD Ryzen, something that we've regularly performed for new GPUs and CPUs as they arrive to market. This one comes sooner than most because of the many changes which have allegedly had significant CPU performance impact already. Rather than speculate and run tests with all of the things applied at once, like updating multiple Windows or game versions simultaneously, we decided to individually test Windows updates, game updates, EFI updates, and memory overclocking, then combine them all together for a full picture of Ryzen's progress over the past month. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA's GTX 1080 Ti ICX card, the new FTW3 model, which will have 3 fans using asynchronous control for their cooling of the GPU, the VRM, and other onboard components. You can learn more at the link in the description below or check our previous ICX card reviews for more information. The testing today will isolate Windows updates for performance testing. We'll also be looking at EFI testing without any changes elsewhere, so just an EFI update, nothing else, so not taking advantage of new EFI features. Then we'll be looking at memory overclocking and eventually compiling everything into a complete list. So this will be a cumulative set of benchmarks. That means that as we go through things, we're going to be stacking on the previous set of charts. So Windows updates will come first, EFI next, and those EFI tests contain the Windows updates. And then after that, the memory overclocking tests, which contain the EFI updates and therefore the Windows updates. So it is cumulative in that nature. The Windows update in particular is an interesting one because there was some talk of Windows updates potentially impacting Ryzen performance in a positive fashion, but most of the testing we saw was posted with potentially other changes or just didn't have initial data that we could use to base off of for how much of an improvement there may have been. So we've based off of our round 1 benchmark data to see how Windows has changed over the last month or so. We put the R7 1700 and R7 1700X back through the bench. The 1700X we were the least excited about. The 1700 was the one that, if you remember, we sort of showed as the champion for the Ryzen 7 lineup. It was clearly the best buy for a gaming audience, particularly because overclocking basically made it equal an 1800X. So it's pretty obvious why we would choose that one in terms of price. Now, that said, we're still putting the 1700X in here because it is the most recent that we tested, and for control reasons, it's the easiest for looking at data comparatively with all these updates applied because our 1700 had issues achieving higher than a 2666 megahertz memory clock without, 1, the newest EFI updates, and 2, without overclocking the CPU itself, which indicates some kind of IMC limitation on our 1700 unit that we received. But the 1700X could hit 2933 no problem. So we'll be able to look at those 2 models for a better understanding of how memory overclocking to a higher frequency like 3466 megahertz or beyond will improve Ryzen performance. We'll tune memory later in the video. We were using EFI 5704 for the first test, that is the Windows update, and then we'll roll the performance in with the newest version, which I believe is 1002 or 1002 beta that we received from ASUS directly. As for the Windows versions, we will be testing with Windows build ending in 970 from March 22nd. That's the newest one at the time of setting up this test. And then that is compared versus version 693 from January 10th, which is the previous version we had on the test platform. As a note here, we do not have updated numbers for Intel or for other AMD CPUs that are not included in the numbers today. So that means that any changes in this Windows build that may have impacted Intel or other AMD CPUs will not be factored into cumulative charts with everything on it because we didn't rerun them. We're really focusing on Ryzen here. So do keep that in mind. These controls in place will have synthetic tests for you on the website that will be linked in the description below along with all the other charts. Everything's there in written form if you prefer that. We're going to be jumping straight into gaming benchmarks for this video, and we'll be sticking with gaming for the entire video. The rest, again, is down there in the article. Starting with Metro Last Light Reliable, as it's had no updates in years, we see that the R7 1700X performs effectively the same as the version that's been accompanied with a Windows update. Overclocked, the 1700X is within test variance for this particular benchmark tool, producing less than a 1 FPS difference in averages between Windows versions. The same is true for the original R7 1700X stock test and 1700X Windows Update test, where we end up within about 1 FPS average, so no change. The R7 1700 shows the same average FPS, For this title, the January 30th Windows 10 build posts no discernible deficit compared to the January 10th or March 22nd builds. They all look about the same. Moving to GTA 5, build 970 and build 693 produced effectively equal results between the overclocked 1700X CPUs, holding true also for the non-overclocked variants. The R7 1700 shows a 2% difference favoring Windows Update. At this point, we don't yet have enough data to definitively state whether this improvement is the result of Windows Update or is just regular variance in testing. Watch Dogs 2 paints a similar picture. We have a statistically insignificant difference between builds 693 and 970, and that's for the R7 1700X when overclocked. The stock R7 1700X with build 970 performs at 84 FPS average, where 693 performs at 82 average. Like with GTA 5, this is enough to start resembling some sort of improvement, but the lack of statistical significance in the overclocked values gives us pause about potential for improvement here. We would need more data to make a more definitive statement as to whether the 2.4% improvement theoretically is caused by the Windows Update, but for now, this is at least consistent with GTA 5. The R7 1700 also posts a similar improvement of roughly 2.9% in averages with build 970. Again, ignoring the 1700X overclock performance equivalents, these numbers are consistent in showing a potential improvement with the Windows Update, however minor it may be. Our later tests will impact this, in theory, in a bigger way. Battlefield 1 starts showing some repeatable, statistically significant differences in our 970 and 693 numbers. This builds on the story we've established with GTA 5 and Watch Dogs 2, but gives us greater confidence that the differences are more than just chance. That said, quick note here, DICE pushed an update called They Shall Not Pass for Battlefield 1 on March 14th, along with a later pushed version 1.08 of the game. Although the extensive patch notes do not indicate any performance improvements as stated by DICE, it is possible that optimizations were made at a game level and not listed. With build 970, the overclocked 1700X performs at 137 average, where build 693 performs at 133.7 FPS average. That's another difference of 2.5%, so not that relevant, but frame times are where it counts. Because we measure frame times and convert them into our 1% and 0.1% FPS numbers, we can see that build 970 posts 111 FPS 1% lows, where 693, again, 2.5% behind in averages, posts a 1% low of 87.3 FPS. Finally, we're seeing significant differences. It's less in averages and more in frame times for this particular game, with 0.1% lows also posting a gain from 72.7 to 99 FPS. And again, these numbers are representative of frame times. The story holds true for the stock 1700X, which runs at 135 average, 102 1% low, and 88 0.1% low, with build 970 against build 693 from the original review. That's an unimportant improvement in averages, but a measurable and repeatable improvement in frame times. Here's a frame time plot for Battlefield 1 on screen now while talking through the rest of the data. This is consistent with our 1700X numbers, although these improvements are not visibly appreciable to the end user. They certainly show up in charts and are important in showing promise for potential performance improvements in other titles later on. This chart is for Ashes of the Singularity, but without the escalation update. Remember, we're trying to test one thing at a time here, not throw a whole bunch of updates into the bucket and call it an improvement. That's nice, but not useful for figuring out the source of the improvement. In Ashes of the Singularity, we're back to what amounts to primarily a statistical insignificance or very small difference overall. We're seeing an improvement in the 1700X overclocked numbers in B970 over B693 of roughly 1.2% in averages, with almost zero difference in frame times when considering 1% and 0.1% low converted FPS values. The 1700X stock with B693 shows, again, a statistically insignificant difference, this time favoring B693, which more or less indicates test variance between two tested values which are effectively identical in performance. There's no difference to speak of here, especially not when the gap is 0.6 FPS. The 1700 is the same story, that's the non-X version. There's no statistical significance here in differences, and frame times are effectively equal. Now we're on to Total War Warhammer. Unfortunately, with all this talk of constraining variables, we were forced to update this title for our benchmark by Steam, and that means there will be changes at a game level. We reached out to our contacts at Creative Assembly to confirm if this update impacts CPU performance, And we have heard back from the communications team, but we're waiting on confirmation from the engineering team to see if updates have improved CPU performance for either vendor. If we receive confirmation, we'll update the article linked in the description below with Creative Assembly's information or quotes as necessary. We suspect the differences you're about to see are a result of potentially the game update more than the Windows update, but either one is critical to show, so we're here anyway. The 1700X B970 benchmark with the game update outmatches the B693 benchmark in significant ways, with the overclocked 1700X posting a frame rate approximately 11% higher at 152 FPS average versus 137 FPS average. Frame times don't show a huge improvement in 1% lows, and the 1700X stock goes from 128 FPS average and 94 FPS 1% lows to 145 average and 110 FPS 1% lows, another significant improvement. We replicated this on the R7 1700, which moved from 120 FPS average to 138 FPS average, with lows also improved. And here's an interesting thing, Total War Warhammer was also the game that showed the biggest difference with SMT disabled versus enabled. So the next thing to look at would be, how do these numbers align with the original numbers with SMT off? Then how do they align with SMT on and the Windows and game updates? This chart contains SMT 0 values for the R7 1700. Here we show that build 970 more or less makes up for the difference in SMT toggling, indicating that one of the two applied updates could have removed the SMT hamstring, at least part of it, that we previously observed. Now, of course, the question is still whether SMT toggling benefits in this title, even with these updates. And the answer is yes. With the performance ceiling still about the same as previously at around 140 FPS average, the R7 1700 is still better with SMT off, but the differences are now minimized. The performance ceiling remains the same in Total War as previously, but we're closer to it without requiring disablement of SMT. We're moving on now to the EFI updates on the Asus Crosshair 6 platform. We previously did test some EFI version updates with our Just Research Ryzen article, that's what it was called, and there was also a video on it. We showed really no difference that was significant in any way on the versions we tested, but this one's a lot more advanced than those, so we'll be going through it. We are on the same Windows Update build as the previous tests laid out. This will be a quick section with largely uninteresting results. And we're moving from version 5704 to version 1002 on the Asus Crosshair 6, after which we'll do the memory overclocking. With the R7 1700, Metro Last Light shows no benefit from strictly performing an EFI update on the Crosshair 6. We'd need to actually use updated features, as AGISA updates were not enough to impact performance here. In GTA 5, moving on already, we're seeing zero noteworthy change from build 970 with 5704 to build 970 with 1002. Moving on swiftly to Watch Dogs 2, we're seeing no significant change from B970 with 5704 to B970 with 1002. We are within variance at this point. Battlefield 1, same story. The improvement is clear from Windows Update, but there's no clear improvement from throwing an EFI update on there as well. Using the new features, sure, but not standalone. This story continues for synthetic tests and for other games benchmarked. It's really not interesting at all, so we're going to move on. But basically what we have so far is a potential improvement from either Windows updates or game updates in Battlefield 1 and Total War Warhammer. The other games did not have updates as stated. Windows updates and the forced game updates are most important in those two titles, BF1 and Total War Warhammer. The others are largely insignificant differences for the most part, and it appears that the games right now, at least these two, BF1 and Total War, are around where performance was when SMT was disabled in our original review. So that's looking better, though you can still disable SMT with these new updates and get better performance than stock. The difference between those numbers is not as great in these two, or at least in the Total War title, which had the biggest difference overall. The ceiling itself, though, doesn't look higher with the 2933 MHz memory or 2666 on the 1700. So let's move on to memory overclocking to see if there are real gains. So a few notes here. If you're not familiar with memory overclocking on Ryzen or Intel, memory overclocking and timing tuning right now is not necessarily trivial with Ryzen. With the newest EFI updates, it is certainly easier, but the process isn't as simple as if you're used to an Intel platform, flipping an XMP switch, going to a frequency dialer and increasing it, and hoping that it will probably work as long as you don't go too crazy. It's not that simple with Ryzen right now. What we had to do was memory training. So we stepped through memory frequency improvements incrementally, one to the next, established stability, and then did the next set of updates and increments. After sorting through 6 kits of memory and spending about an entire day on this task, we found that our Trident Z 3200 MHz CL14 kit seems to work the best right now, and that is because it has Samsung B dies, whereas other kits like the HyperX kits, which largely use Hynix dies, generally have issues with overclocking or even achieving their stock capable frequencies as advertised on the sticks with Ryzen and Ryzen 7 and the motherboards that we have, including Gigabyte and Asus. And this is something that we've talked about previously. So B dies are where to go for Samsung, from Samsung, for these memory kits. If you want to achieve a higher clock, you need to start there. G.Skill has a lot of them that are known to be binned as B dies specifically. We've also since requested an even higher bin of memory from G.Skill, so should have further updates on this front for you soon. But for today, we got stuck around 3466 megahertz, and we're awaiting additional shipment from G.Skill to push further. So thanks to EFI updates, direct support from Buildzoid and Asus, and support from G.Skill, we were able to walk through the 6 or so hours of memory training required and tuning to establish a stable overclock of 3466 megahertz with CL14 timings. We were able to hit 3600 megahertz and tried pretty damn hard to stay there, but it just wasn't stable for actual load usage with the hardware that we have available, apparently, and we'll have to try other CPUs and other memory kits going forward. A lot of tuning is figuring out whether your R7 chips respond better to reference clock tuning or memory multiplier tuning, and then going from there, figuring out if you want to operate from a base of 24, 26.66, or 32x for the multiplier and the memory. This is mostly a guess and check game, which takes the majority of the time required. After you've established those baselines for reference clock and memory multipliers, you should be able to get a stable OC that will run without any issues. We're using the 1700X for this since all the most recent tests were conducted on that chip, and because it had a 2933 megahertz base for all of those tests, making it very easy to do the comparison. The 1700, as stated, was a lower frequency for the non-overclocked tests that we did, and then higher for the overclocked ones, making it less linear to compare. We'll have the synthetic and rendering benchmark results in the article below, as stated previously, and we'll just go through gaming now. Starting again with Metro Last Light, the 3466 MHz 1700X with stock clocks sees a performance bump from 123 to 125 FPS average, with lows effectively identical around 81% and around 0.1% That's an improvement of about 1.6% by going from 2933 to 3466 MHz with the Windows update and the EFI update included, along with the memory overclock. So we're seeing about a 1.6% gain here. Looking next to core overclocking, we see the 1700X at 3.9 GHz with 3466 MHz memory is placing around 129 FPS average, or roughly 1.9% ahead of the 1700X at 3.9 GHz with 2933 MHz memory, the change being only in the memory. Compared to the original results, which had B693 and 2933 on the 3.9 GHz overclock, we have moved up about 2.4%, from 125.7 FPS average to 128.7 FPS average. We might as well add these into the original tables as well for comparison. Note that the Intel series and the 1800X haven't been retested with the new Windows or game updates, so anything which impacts Ryzen could theoretically also impact Intel or the 1800X. We haven't yet determined this. On this table, we're seeing our best effort 1700X line item with a core 3.9 GHz OC and memory 3466 MHz OC, landing around where the original reviews R7 1700 4 GHz OC with SMT disabled landed. We are below the i7 4790K stock CPU, which sits at 136.7 FPS average, with the 1% worst frame times converting to an FPS of 101 and 0.1% worst to 94 FPS. The 7700K modern flagship is at 146 FPS average with 104 and 95, 1% and 0.1% lows representing the frame times. The 1700X with its memory OC and core overclocks run at 88 FPS average at 1% low and 56 FPS average at 0.1% lows. Disabling SMT, as illustrated by previous tests, improves frame times in this particular title. Back to GTA 5 for the next one. Here we're seeing our 1700X at 3.9 GHz with 3466 MHz memory performing at around 135 FPS average, with an improvement in frame times over base. The 1700X at 3.9 GHz with 2933 MHz memory is at around 128 FPS average, showing an improvement of about 5.7% by overclocking the memory to 3466 MHz. If we kill the core OC, removing the core OC, and just run the memory OC, we're at roughly the same place, 127 FPS average with lows around 80, versus a stock 1700X with 2933 MHz memory. The 3.9 GHz version with 3466 MHz memory improves performance by about 11%. Again, that's by overclocking memory and core. To compare to a simplified stack, that puts the 135 FPS 1700X above the 1800X when it was overclocked with build 693, or the 1800X's best case, in other words. It is also below the i7-4790K in averages and frame times, which leads by about 4.4% average. The overclocked i7-7700K is next to be compared to the overclocked 1700X. The 7700K is similar in price to the 1700, and for pure gaming builds, it should be alongside the 1700 for head-to-head comparisons. Keep in mind also that the 1700 can support the same overclock and memory overclock as our compared 1700X, which means performance is identical at the same clocks. The 7700K overclocked is at 151 FPS average with 101 and 93 FPS lows, and the 7700K still therefore holds a performance lead of about 11.9%, which is down from its previous performance lead of 18.9%, so there is improvement here. That said, we have not yet retested the 7700K with build 970 of Windows 10 or with memory overclocking of its own, and the 7700K here is at a 3200 MHz CL16 memory clock and timings. In Watch Dogs 2, the stock 1700X with 3466 MHz memory places at 100 FPS average with lows in the 70s and 60s, versus the 1700X stock with 2933 MHz memory. This is a significant improvement of 19%. So far, all of our improvements in this same comparison have been in the single-digit percentages, making Watch Dogs 2 a bit of an interesting title. We also know that Watch Dogs 2 is particularly thread-intensive and previously published a video and article studying the CPU impact from different settings in the game, and so there could be some sort of cross-CCX traffic that benefits from the faster memory in this case. Looking at the 3.9 GHz 1700X at 2933, we're faced with an average FPS of about 87, which previously showed no noteworthy improvement over the stock 1700X with 2933 MHz memory. Memory is clearly choking Ryzen in this specific title, and looking against Intel, the 7700K overclocked lands at 114 FPS average, 91% low frame times, and 76 0.1% lows. The 1700X with core and memory OC lands at 107 average, 75 1% low, and 60 FPS 0.1% lows. Again, we'd have to overclock Intel's memory for final validation of this title, but this gives an idea as to where Ryzen's memory overclocking performance lands. Back to Battlefield 1, it appears that the most important item is the B970 Windows update and/or update to Battlefield 1 since previous testing, after which point overclocking becomes less significant. The 1700X with its 3.9 GHz OC and 3466 memory posted no significant statistical difference versus the 1700X at 3.9 GHz with 2933 MHz memory. The difference here is effectively 0%. Battlefield 1, like Watch Dogs 2, has its own unique performance needs. Looking at the stock 1700X versus the stock 1700X at 3466 MHz memory, so the memory is OC'd, we also see an effective equal average frame rate, albeit with improvements to the 0.1% low metrics from 86 to 95 FPS. Back on the bigger chart with the other tests and CPUs, this lands the new 1700X metrics around the i5-6600K at 137 FPS average, 89 1% low, and 77 0.1% lows, where the 1700X has a lead in frame times over the i5, but is around the same in averages. Versus the nearest i7, the 1700X is again under the i7-4790K, which is at 140 FPS average. For the next chart, again, we haven't updated Ashes yet because that's not the point of this test. Ashes appears to care about memory overclock more than core overclock in this test configuration. The 1700X at 3.9 GHz with 3466 MHz memory places at about 41 FPS average, just ahead of the 39 FPS average of the stock 1700X with 3466 MHz memory. The latter of the two, with its 39 FPS average, posts an improvement over the stock 1700X with 2933 MHz memory of 18.8% versus our best of B693 metrics. This is another title that seems to make use of the gains. And again, we haven't rerun Intel yet or overclocked its memory, so mileage may vary until we get those results in, but comparatively, the 1700X is now price competitive with the 7700K in this title, as the 7700K is running 43 FPS average with its core overclock, or 42 without. We're curious to see if a memory OC benefits KB Lake in this particular game if we were to spend the same amount of time working on that. But for now, the 1700X, with all of our overclocking effort, is starting to claw back some ground. Finally, we have Total War Warhammer. Again, keep in mind that this game just received a patch and we haven't yet rerun the other tests, including Intel or FX benchmarks. For the R7 1700X, overclocking memory to 3466 MHz with a stock 1700X provides a performance boost to 160 FPS average and 124 FPS 1% lows. This is up from the stock 1700X with 2933 MHz memory at 145 average for performance improvement of roughly 9.9%, versus the 3.9 GHz 1700X with 2933 MHz memory and B970 Windows, we see an improvement of about 5.1%. The core OC and memory OC puts us up to 165 FPS average for a gain of about 8.8% over the overclocked 1700X with 2933 MHz memory. And now tested against the other items on the chart, the 7700K overclocked lands at 187 FPS average with the stock 7700K at 186 FPS average. It is possible that we're bumping up against other limits here given the proximity of performance between these two line items. The overclocked i5 7600K runs at 177 FPS average with poorer frame times compared to the 7700K, more similar to the stock 1700X. In its best light with all the overclocks, the 1700X lands AMD ahead of the 6600K i5 and behind the 7600K i5 in averages, though lows are ahead at 112. There's a lot more to do as always, but we'll leave that here for now. There's a ton of data to sift through. And for today, that gives us a baseline, at least, for improvements from more effort and overclocking than might be normal for these types of benchmarks. My thanks to our team for helping. Patrick spent the better part of a day really establishing a stable memory and core overclock on the 1700X with all these changes. And Andrew will undoubtedly be spending a long time editing this video with all of the charts. After the overclocking effort, note here that we did have to keep the Kraken X62 on there. That cooler was needed to ensure that the 1700X did not encounter thermal throttles when testing, because in our original review we showed that it is possible to thermal throttle that CPU if you're using a worse cooler and you're blasting voltages to try and sustain higher clocks or something like that. Or just generally if there's more traffic on the cores between TCXs or otherwise, just in general more traffic, you might have thermal problems. So we threw a cooler on there to ensure that was not a concern. We do that with all these tests unless we're testing thermals. And there's more thermal testing coming soon though, so I'll leave that for that future content. For now, we've got you the updated FPS numbers. We have you the data to sift through. It's been provided. Look forward to future testing. There's synthetics in the article linked below. Thank you for watching. As always, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus if you'd like to help us out directly and purchase us something like a bot that automatically reads through these scripts and edits the videos. I'm sure that's possible, right, with the Patreon money we have. Otherwise, subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.